Summer's supposed to be the easy season. So why are so many people quietly Googling a therapist between summer Fridays? Because more daylight doesn't fix the hard stuff. Sometimes it just turns the volume up. Grow does therapy differently. Therapy is not only for when you're in crisis. Grow Therapy is here for all the moments when you decide you want more. More support, more clarity, more tools. Mental health isn't a destination you reach, it's something you build, and Grow makes that easier. Grow connects you with thousands of high-quality licensed therapists across the U.S., offering both virtual and in-person sessions, nights and weekends. You can search by what matters, like insurance, specialty, identity, or availability, and get started in as little as 2 days. There are no subscriptions, no long-term commitments. You just pay per session. Grow helps you find therapy on your time. The therapist you want takes your insurance on Grow. Grow accepts over 125 insurance plans. Sessions average $21 with insurance, and some pay as little as $0 depending on their plan. Visit growtherapy.com/booknow today to get started. That's growtherapy.com/booknow. growtherapy.com/booknow. Availability and coverage vary by state and insurance plan.
This is episode 433 of That Shakespeare Life.
Hi, I'm Rachel Sweeney, medieval art historian studying monsters. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend Cassidy Cash.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
Close your eyes and imagine yourself in the 16th century English countryside. Sounds of ploughs rattle in the distant fields, and the delightful squeals of children at play fill the air. It's quiet, you think, quieter than you're used to, but loud and lively all the same. The air is pure and it smells sweet with the natural floral fragrances of honeysuckle and apple blossom and lavender. There are no motors here, no planes in the sky, no pylons or wind turbines or television aerials. There's no suffocating smog, air, or light pollution. There's little to obscure your view of the wild, undulating fields, which, to your surprise, are sparsely inhabited by houses and instead occupied by droves of grazing cattle and sheep. In the distance, you hear a horse neigh and a washerwoman hum as she pegs out her laundry. The smell of woodfire fills the air, delicious aromas of crisping meats and yeasty dough, fresh, juicy fruits, and the comforting, creamy smells of curds and whey. Soon will be the call for dinner, and hordes of tired laborers will return home and settle for the evening. Then will come nightfall and the sounding of curfew bells. It's darker than you expected, much darker. There's no electricity here, and you are unaccustomed to the thin glow of candles as your only form of light. Soon these candles will stop burning, for the night has arrived and the day has ended. Welcome to the 16th century. Welcome to the Tudor Home. These are the opening lines of Beth Ann Watt's latest book titled Inside the Tudor Home. And Beth Ann is here with us this week to take us on a tour of what the rooms, routines, noises, sights, and sounds would have been like for the 16th century, to explore, define, and even challenge your ideas about what it was like to be home for Shakespeare's England. Beth Ann Catherine Watts is a social historian specializing in childhood and domestic history. She's an elected member of the Royal Historical Society, works for the Children's History Society, and is currently writing her PhD thesis on the lives of children in medieval England. She has written in both academic and popular spheres about historical homes and domestic life, the lives of children and youths, and attitudes towards health, medicine, and hygiene throughout British history. Beth Ann's writing has appeared in magazines, websites, blogs, and podcasts like this one, including history hits Not Just the Tudors and the BBC's Who Do You Think You Are? Beth Ann also hosts her own podcast and accompanying magazine, A History of Childhood, and shares updates about her research on social media. We'll have links to all of Beth Ann's work in the show notes today, so make sure you check back there to follow all that she has to share about history. As you're listening to the show today, you can see visual extras that coordinate with our conversation as a member of That Shakespeare Life. Members enjoy ad-free listening to all of our episodes, along with sneak peeks at upcoming shows and insider extras. Become a member right now to explore the bonus visual content for this week's show at patreon.com/That Shakespeare Life. Hello, Beth Ann. Welcome to That Shakespeare Life.
Hi, Cassidy. Thank you for having me.
All of Shakespeare's references to fencing are talking about the sport of swords. So in his plays, that's what we see. But Beth Ann's book suggests that there's another kind of fencing that gained popularity in Tudor England for its ability to defend houses from trespassers. Of course, we're talking about the fence around your property. Beth Ann, tell us about how a fence on your property might have been a new fashion for homes in the Tudor period, and what exactly did they look like?
So you might not expect this, but fences were vital in the 16th century. They had lots of different purposes, lots of different functions. One of the most important functions that a fence had in the 16th century was to establish a boundary around a dwelling. So, like you just said, Cassidy, it would keep out trespassers, it would keep out burglars, and it would keep in wandering animals and toddling children, which I think is very important. Fences were especially important in agricultural places, so rural countrysides and remote, far out sort of places like that, where animal husbandry was the main livelihood of people. Having a fence meant that farmers or sheep shearers didn't lose out on their livelihood by their livestock roaming away, and it also meant that houses could keep their food source closer to home, so that chickens or their pigs. Fences also provided privacy, and it meant that people could bathe, go to the toilet, they could do their laundry, they could even sleep outdoors without the risk of prying eyes. Fences for this enclosed space to do with whatever they wanted. They gave gardens. Households had fish ponds, herb gardens, recreational gardens called pleasance gardens. And actually, there's a really lovely source that comes from 16th century London, which mentions fenced gardens where Buckingham Palace now stands, with people growing domestic crops and produce like lettuces and root vegetables that they cultivated and they used in their own diet. Now, as for what they looked like, obviously this varied a lot by location and by materials that were available to the people who lived in these areas. For the most part, in agricultural places, fences would be made from rudimentary stones, so rocks piled upon each other. They had no sort of distinction, no pattern, they were just piled up rocks, as simple as that. More popularly, fences were made from wood. So there was a type of fencing called a groin fencing, which was effectively reinforced timbers which slotted together, kind of like a waffle. And it really helped to keep everything out and keep everything in. There were also things called lattice fences, which, if you're familiar with the term wattle and daub, it's the same sort of construction. So basically, the Tudors would use sticks, long sticks, called wattle, and they would weave them together, similarly like a waffle again. And again, that would provide a reinforced structure that the Tudors could use to separate their gardens.
So lots of different kinds of fencing spattering across the landscape. Then I suppose almost personal choice, but I would like to think that there were trendy versions, that this style is better at this time. And so you can kind of track which decade they were in by what was popular. How interesting.
Definitely.
The nobility notwithstanding, how many people typically lived in a Tudor home, in addition to the main family? I know the wife of the household was typically the household manager, but as I understand it, there would have been laborers and servants, even among the middling sort, and perhaps even some of the lower class households as well. So how many people are living in a place we're calling a Tudor home?
This really fascinated me when I discovered this, when I was doing my research for the book. Because on average, a 16th century household consisted of only 4 individuals which was really surprising. I would have expected so many more because we hear from all these sources of lots of different people living together under one roof, especially within the poorer classes. But actually, the nuclear family itself was pretty small. When we factor in the mortality rates of the 16th century, a family might have lots of children, but only half of them may survive to later childhood and adulthood. Obviously, some families were misnomers. So we do have cases where families were larger or smaller than average. And this does skew the trends a little. If we look at families like Thomas More's family, he had 5 children. William Shakespeare had 3 children. And the royal family itself, there were 7 children. In Henry VIII's nursery, I suppose, he had 6 other siblings. But not all of them did survive to adulthood. We also have to consider households consisting of different family relations, and this was especially prevalent in the lower classes and the merchant classes, where you may have lots of visitors or transient people coming in and out of the doors. So you might expect to see guests, grandparents, adopted children, and orphans. As you said, Cassidy, there might be servants, there might be wards, which were children who were under the protection of a member of, perhaps not a biological family member, but perhaps an uncle or a distant relation. You might also have lodgers, and this was especially popular in urban areas where people would labor. So you might have like shopkeepers and their apprentices living together, and butchers, and all of this sort of different trades. You may also have godchildren and friends. They were very popular. You see lots of sources from the 16th century which depict people, huddled together in their living rooms or in their kitchens, and they're, talking with distant relations, or they're talking with neighbors and friends. And it's really nice to look at these sources and see like how many people would use a 16th century house, not just for living in, but also as a place of community and a place where they could come together. I think the typical Tudor household was such a wide array of people. Households weren't static. They were permeable. They were open to transient people coming in and out. And, so did animals. Animals, especially in rural areas, would wander through the houses with all the other people living inside. They'd wander in when people were asleep, when people were cooking. And there are accounts especially of pigs wandering into people's houses, which I find quite funny. Yeah, pigs.
Yeah, that is surprising. I'm envisioning just the front door is open and here they come into the kitchen and out the back door.
And obviously we have to remember that people did keep pets back then. So there would have been dogs and cats, and some of them would have been domesticated, but some of them were stray animals that would have just wandered in and out with the people who used to come in and out as well.
When we're thinking about how many people were sleeping in, which I think is the framework my mind goes to about how many people were living somewhere, I think of the thoughts of how many beds would have been on a property. And when we're thinking about the places where people sleep at night, Beth Ann writes that, quote, although not as expensive as exciting foreign goods or as provoking as religious talismans, beds were perhaps the most precious of all items of Tudor furniture, end quote. Beth Ann, share with us some of the primary documents and court records you uncovered that brought you to this conclusion that beds were pretty significant.
Okay, so beds were arguably the most important item of furniture a Tudor could own. A bed was somewhere that you could relax in. It was somewhere that you could get warm. It was somewhere that you could have intercourse. It was central not only to the Tudor home itself, but also to a Tudor's life. And I think we have to remember, this is a society where the bed was the place that you were born in. Married couples could consolidate their relationship there. It was a place where sick or invalid people went to get better. And it was also a place where people died. So there was a very, very high likelihood in the 16th century that the bed in which you were born could also be the one that you died in. I think it's a testament to how important beds were in the 16th century that we see them all the time in wills. Now, at first, I thought this was really unusual. Why would you want to sleep in somebody else's bed? But for the Tudors, it made sense. Beds were expensive. They were relatively recent modern inventions. The Tudors had sort of reformed the idea of a bed. A medieval bed, for example, was smaller, lower to the ground. They were called truckle beds, and they were effectively just boxes that you would sleep in that provided no support for your back or for your limbs. They were stuffed with hay, and they were pretty uncomfortable in comparison to a Tudor bed. So, for example, the Tudors introduced popper mattresses, and this is actually where we get the term sleep tight from, because the Tudor mattresses were a lot sturdier, were a lot more solid, a lot more comfortable than earlier mattresses in the medieval period and before. The Tudors also introduced stuffing feathers and wool within pillows or on their testers, which were effectively their duvets. They even had bed linen called ticks, which, as the name suggests, would repel any vermin that would wander in to the bed, things like fleas, lice, ticks. So they were pretty sophisticated inventions. Tudor beds also came with bed hangings, especially within the upper and noble classes. And these bed hangings were essential at providing privacy. They provided insulation, they stopped drafts, and they just made the bed so much more comfortable. Now, going back to wills, if we look at wills, and this is my favorite way to personally get a close insight into Tudor household interiors, we see lots of beds bequeathed to people. So, bequeathed to their family, to neighbours, to friends, to guildsmen. And when we break down the construct of a bed, we have to remember that beds were expensive to produce. The timber itself was expensive to chop down and to carve and to manufacture. Sometimes we do see the Tudors bequeathing bed hangings or bed linens just by itself, which I think, again, is a testament to how valuable a commodity these items were. William Shakespeare actually left his second best bed to his wife, Anne Hathaway. And, for a long, long time, people thought, oh, this is just a snub. Why would he give second best bed? Why wouldn't he give the best bed? But actually, I don't think this is a snub at all. I think this is a reflection of William's affection for Anne and a reflection of their relationship. In the 16th century and the 17th century, the best bed would have been given to visitors who were staying at the home, or they were only really to display ornate decorations like bed hangings and linen. So the second best bed was actually the one that would be slept in. William and Anne, I imagine, spent a lot of time in their second best bed as a married couple, and it was probably an item that they really treasured and really valued. Another really important bed that you can still actually go to see today is the bed of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. And the Victoria and Albert Museum in London currently have this bed on display, and it's made up with all the different linens, all the different layers, and it's really, really impressive to see. I don't think we can kind of understand as modern listeners, as modern people, the importance of a bed. But when we see this Tudor iteration of something so familiar, we understand just how important and just how vital it was to everyday life.
Let's talk about Tudor bathrooms. Would Tudor homes have had a bathroom inside, or would they have had an outhouse? Or what were the practical realities for using the restroom in a typical Tudor home?
Yeah. So in this period, bathrooms as we know it weren't very common for the lowest classes. Perhaps, if you were middling merchant classes, you would have a dedicated space for your toilet, for your bath. But for the vast majority of people, they didn't have those enclosed rooms. So they would have used outdoor privies or outhouses, like you said, or they would have used something called latrines, which were pits dug into the ground, into gardens. And actually, in cities, there are actually examples of communal latrines, which I think is quite gross.
It sounds pretty gross, yeah.
Yeah, where all the neighbors and all the people who lived in the street could come and just, empty their bowels in the same place. It's just horrible. Some larger houses did have dedicated rooms to do their business in. So some people, for example, would have something called a close stool, and that is basically like a chair, like a commode with effectively a bucket in the seat where they could do their business. But most people used chamber pots, and chamber pots were revolutionary because it meant that you could stay indoors to do your business. You didn't have to go outside in the wintertime or in the rain or at night time. You could stay in the warmth and the comfort of your own home. There is a stereotype that people in the 16th century threw their waste away out through their window, and I'm sure that did happen. But I would like to imagine that 16th century people disposed of their waste with decency, perhaps in a pit or far away from their actual homestead. Henry VIII actually had his own bathroom. And if we look at some of the palaces and the castles of the time, you will see bathrooms or toilets. I think it was Hampton Court Palace. Henry VIII had installed a sunken bathtub that had really sophisticated plumbing and water that flushed everything away. But yeah, for the most part, people just made do with what they had with chamber pots.
I feel like Henry VIII's motivation there was highly personal with all that he had going on physically. I think that makes sense that he would be like, no, we have to have a solution.
Yeah.
I'm glad to know that people didn't always throw their waste out the window, however. That was something that I've heard. And I know that it occurred, especially in cities like London. I know sometimes that was just the reality. But it's nice to think that it wasn't ubiquitous. It wasn't just, this is what you do, is throw it out the window. Because in the context of like living in the countryside, you wouldn't want to just pour it right out the window and have it right next to your house. And
no.
In my mind, I have this image of a real estate agent, and I'm not saying this existed for Tudor England, but when you're house hunting, having to be like, okay, but how close is it to the communal latrine? Because I don't want my bedroom right next to that.
Yeah. No, I think we kind of have this perception of the Tudors and the 16th century, as being quite unhygienic, but that's not the case at all. These were people who were very conscious of hygiene. They were very conscious of cleanliness. They did keep themselves clean. They did have methods and ways of washing themselves and cleaning themselves. They did have bathtubs, not necessarily a bathroom, but a sort of tub that they could lift and they could move around, a portable bathtub, effectively, where they could sit in their garden or they could sit in front of fireplaces so that they would stay warm and they could still become clean. They weren't these people who were constantly dirty and stinky. That's a myth. It wasn't really until the 17th century that we do start to see more sophisticated bathrooms and plumbing and taps and all of that, running water, stuff like that. But yeah, the Tudors did definitely have a place to go with relative privacy to stay clean and to do their business.
In Tudor England, as today, Beth Ann writes that the kitchen was the heart of the home in Tudor England. Beth Ann, share with us what a kitchen would have looked like. How would it have been laid out, and what parts constituted kitchen space before the era of refrigerators or ovens? What would the floor plan of a kitchen be like for Shakespeare's England?
Okay. So this is quite a difficult question to answer because there are so many different factors that we need to consider. We have to think about what kind of house that we're looking at. Are we looking at a typical Tudor cottage, the black and white houses? Are we looking at long houses, townhouses? Are we looking at palaces? People conducted their business from houses, especially in merchant areas and urban areas. So people like bakers, confectioners, butchers, for example, may have operated their businesses from their own homes. So in cities especially, we see a lot of houses, especially later Tudor houses and Shakespeare, sort of era houses, where the downstairs, the ground floor would have housed the kitchen, and then the upper stories then would have housed the living quarters of people who lived there. For the most part, we can expect the Tudor kitchen to have the same sort of elements, within lots of different houses. So they would have fires, a place where they would cook their food, a place where they could boil their water, a place where they could stay warm. And these could take the forms of lots of different things. So the Tudors might have a fireplace, they might have an open fire, an open hearth, and something called a trivet, which they would boil their pots and their pans and everything on top of. Fireplaces, open fires, were central to rooms. But by the time of Shakespeare, they were more likely to be along a wall. And this is because, at the time, 16th century reforms were really drumming in the importance of safety, especially when lots and lots of children and animals were hurting themselves with these open fires. So by the time of Shakespeare, towards 17th century, we do see this introduction of fireplaces and chimneys, which removed all of the smoke from the kitchen, from the living area, and took it away from the family and from the house. There were also spaces dedicated in the Tudor kitchen for water. So this would be a place where people would prepare their food, they could wash their dishes. Some people would have washed their laundry indoors, although for the most part, this took place outside. And you would often find, going back to the previous point, that people would wash themselves in their kitchens rather than a dedicated bathroom, because this was where the water was. Tudor kitchens also had places where they could prepare food. So they may have something called a trestle table, which is just effectively a long table where they could prepare their food or they could eat their food with their families. You also might find lots of different tools and implements along the tables and along the counters. So you'd find knives, pots, pans, everything that's essential to cooking and food preparation. And like you said, refrigeration, that was a major part of 16th century life. And obviously this is the time where refrigerators hadn't been invented yet. So how did they keep their food cool? How did they keep the food safe? A typical 16th century home would have a pantry. And this is the place where they would store their food, especially things like dairy, cheeses, meat, milk. And it really did help in preserving these foods and stop people from getting really unwell. It also cut down on how often women would have to shop and go to the market and waste abundant food just because it had started to spoil in the heat, or perhaps vermin like mice had gotten into it. It also meant that women would, they wouldn't have to go and churn their butter as frequently as they did, and they wouldn't have to go and milk their cows as frequently as they did. And it really cut down the amount of time that a woman in particular, as the head of the household effectively, was spent doing tasks that took her away from her family. As for the floor plan of the Tudor kitchen, if you imagine a stereotypical Tudor longhouse, perhaps just one long room like a barn, we can imagine a cold pantry at one end of the room, and this is where they would have stored their meats, etc., their fruit, whatever. And then on the other side, we would expect to see the fireplace where this food would be cooked. And then within the center of the room, that's where we'll find the food preparation and the tables and all of that sort of, dining area.
When I visited Shakespeare's birthplace in Stratford-upon-Avon for the first time, I was surprised because when I walked in, you were right in the kitchen. There's no foyer, there's no entryway, there's not like a dining room to your left and something else to your right. You walk in and the whole downstairs of this entire home is just kitchen. And it's decorated there the way it would have been for Shakespeare's lifetime. So you really step into the past when you walk through the doors. But that was something that struck me. And I thought it was just because I was, an American, but I think it's because this really is a different architecturally than now in a big way, because all of the living space was upstairs. So I got the impression that if you were to, as you say, have guests over or have someone visit, that downstairs room was really multifunctional. It was your kitchen, it was your dining room, it was where your parlor, where you greet people. If you walk in, you're there. So when you say it's the heart of the home, it's not just because this is where the food gets prepared. It's because this room really did welcome and warm and house, everybody right there.
Yeah. Yeah. And, to add on to your point there, we do have lots of sources of people sitting in their kitchens around their fireplaces, especially in the wintertime, sharing communal meals or with their families. And this is still something that we do today. The kitchen is still very much the heart of the home. People still sit around the coffee table and share meals with their families. And like you said, the Tudor kitchen was a communal place and it was the heart of the home. I would really recommend Googling an artist called Simon Benning, and he was a late medieval artist. And he depicted a lot of kitchens in his artwork. And one of my favorite pieces of his art is called The Month February. And in this drawing, you can see a typical 16th century family sitting in their kitchen around their open fire, and their little boy is having a wee outside his door, which I just think it just makes me laugh. But going quickly, just to go back, some of the more wealthier houses would have outhouses, if not outhouses as in bathrooms, but outhouses like butteries, chicken coops, places where they'd have their honey, ice houses, all of these different things that were effectively extensions of their kitchens.
I hadn't considered that Shakespeare might have had an ice house outside of his home, but these sort of array of outbuildings. I'm going to go chase that down later and learn more about that. In her book, Beth Ann dedicates an entire chapter to what she calls the nursery. And this was the most surprising part of the book for me because I had not explored this part of a Tudor house before. I hadn't really considered this setup. Beth Ann, explain for us what the nursery is and where would this have been situated in the house?
Okay, so I am a childhood historian, so I'll try not to go on too much about this. But like I said with the kitchens, we really have to remember that the nursery was entirely dependent on the wealth of a family, where they lived, how many children that they had in their household, and what period that they were living in. So whether they were early Tudor, which would have lived in longer houses, barns, where privacy was honestly at a premium. They didn't have doors, they didn't have walls. Families would have slept in one elongated room. And like you said, would have shared their meals, would have bathed, would have done everything in this one central hub. Towards the Elizabethan era, towards Shakespeare's time, we do see the emergence of dedicated rooms and the emergence of privacy. So you would have walls, barriers, dividers, whatever, that would separate the longhouse into dedicated rooms. And this is when we start to see the nursery established as its own distinct space. So if we think about urban areas in particular, houses were literally raised. They went from being single-story, ground floor dwellings to having stairs. And this meant that the living quarters would be upstairs, and then above that would be the bedrooms and the nursery, the the places where people could go to rest, to get away from everything, in their regular everyday lives. So we do see, especially towards the end of the 16th century, that children do have their own bedrooms. They do have dedicated spaces. We do see a lot of sources that mention children being educated in these spaces, especially with the rise in literacy towards the end of the 16th century, where children would read or they would do their schoolwork in their homes. In poorer areas, this wasn't always the case, and children might not have had the luxury of having their own private room where they could do their recreational activities and, work on their education. So we do see in a lot of rural cases that children, it's quite horrible actually, because there are some really damning reports of rural children, especially poorer children, dying in horrible ways because they don't have these private spaces. We do read about babies and toddlers wandering downstairs and, breaking their necks or breaking their limbs. We do read about children wandering into open fires or toppling into boiling water. There are some cases in busier towns and cities where children who perhaps didn't have these private areas, these nurseries, where they were kidnapped. As we've mentioned earlier, the house was very open, was very permeable, and people could come in and out as they pleased effectively. So we do have cases in the 16th century coroner's records of strangers or even neighbors, people who knew these children, who would come and kidnap the child or, would just do really nefarious things with these children. We also see, as I mentioned earlier, the pigs. The pigs were a plight for these Tudor people. And in one really horrible record, there's the 3-year-old daughter of a man called Jocelyn. And she didn't have a nursery. She was just laid out in her cradle in front of the fireplace in the main room of the house. And this pig wanders in and effectively bites her, and this little girl dies. And that is quite a common thing that we do see in the death records of the time. So to conclude, really, to answer your question, it really depends on a number of factors whether the 16th century home did have a nursery or not. For the most part, nurseries and dedicated spaces for children did start to emerge, towards the end of the 16th century. And Shakespeare probably would have been familiar with the concept of a nursery. For those earlier Tudors, maybe not so much. This is when we do see the abundance of, coroner's records. So I think it really depends what era you're looking at.
I think that brings a whole new perspective on the comparison we can make between the architectural layout of Shakespeare's birthplace, which, as I remembered, it does have rooms upstairs, but it is, as you mentioned, very permeable. There's not all of the clear distinctions between this room and that room. There's more like sides to the spaces, but then that's way different from what we see of by the time New Place is where Shakespeare's living. The architecture of that house is quite different in terms of the rooms and the layout. And what you're outlining here, and that's just a horrible thought of all of these ways that children were quite vulnerable because of the nature of the openness of the home. So I guess that's why people went on to send their children out of the home. But in Beth Ann's chapter on nurseries, she does write about popular historians mentioning that infants were sent out of the home to be cared for by someone other than family for that first year. Beth Ann, is this because children were so vulnerable for that first year? Or have you found evidence that families did raise their children at home for the first year, just maybe setting up a dedicated space for that to increase safety?
So all of this sort of arises from the argument of one historian. And back in the 1980s, there was a historian called Philip Aries, and he perpetuated this idea that the medieval and the Tudor people didn't love their children because they did send them away, or they were quite neglectful. They didn't really care. Children were dying all the time. They could just have more. But that's not really the case at all. And again, if we think about the relationship between parents and children of the time, it doesn't really fit the stereotype at all. Tudor parents, 16th century parents, were very affectionate towards their children. And this is testament, when we see wills and written records, especially from the later periods, where, children will write that, they miss their parents because they've been sent to school, or they, can't wait to see their mother again. And I just think it's really lovely that we have those records that exist. So I think sending children away, again, depended on a bunch of different factors, like the wealth of a family, their position in society, their locations. Did they live in a town, or did they live in a remote countryside where they were perhaps, not very close to other civilizations? And then we have to think of the child itself. What is the gender of the child? It was more common for male children to be sent away and out of the home than it was for female children. We also have to consider the birth order of the children. So perhaps the eldest son would stay at home to continue the family's business or continue their trade, and the third or fourth son might be sent away to establish himself elsewhere. We also have to think about the family's aspirations, and you see this a lot in the 16th century. We've got the machinations of so many different families, in the aftermath of the plague and the sweating sickness, and these class boundaries are starting to permeate. We've got people rising from the very bottom rung of the social ladder to the very top. We can just look at people like Anne Boleyn or Thomas Wolsey, and they were born relatively lowly, and that they rose to great heights. So we do have to consider that as well when we're looking at children being sent away in the 16th century. We know that it did happen. Our records, there are a plethora of records which suggest that this did happen quite frequently. Infants, for example, may have been sent away for safety reasons, like you said. They may have been sent away for their health, particularly if a child was very frail or was very vulnerable. Infants may have been sent to hospitals, which weren't modern hospitals as we would recognize them now, but they also served as orphanages, places where aid was dispensed. They could have even been sent to hospitals which were called hospitals, but they were actually elementary schools. Some infants may have been sent away for wet nursing to the homes of friends or neighbours or strangers to nurse their infants, especially if their mother had died in childbirth and there was no one around to nurse the child. So we do see lots of sources from the Tudor period of children who grew up together as milk siblings, and they enjoy this relationship with other children who aren't biologically related to them, but because they were sent to these households of wet nurses, they sort of developed this quasi-familial relationship that went beyond the boundaries of blood. It was actually the older children, rather than the infants, who would be sent away from their families more frequently. And I don't use the term sent away as a negative term. Parents would send their children away for the betterment of their prospects.
From your work into this topic, if we're new to this branch of history and the idea of what the specifics were inside a Tudor home, and we definitely want to explore more, especially after all that you've shared with us here today, what are some additional resources you can recommend we use to learn more?
So I actually think that we live in a really great time for accessible history. You can just hop online now and Google museums and libraries and archives for free. It doesn't take much research, really. You don't have to actually physically go to these places anymore. You can just do them from your armchair, from, your phone, your smartphone. I would definitely recommend websites like the Early English Books Online, which is a really great resource for reading books and texts and other sources like letters and anything you can think of, really, from the Middle Ages all the way up until the Reformation and Shakespeare's time, and probably later as well. You can also, I would definitely recommend going to places like the British Library or the Bodleian Library, which again have online collections for people to browse, and they're entirely free. You can zoom in on all these manuscripts and all these really gorgeous illuminated letters, and you can see Henry VIII's handwriting and William Shakespeare's folios, and they're just really, really just spectacular resources. The National Archives as well, I would definitely say that they're worth exploring.
These are wonderful resources. And of course, I'm going to recommend that you start with Beth Ann Watt's book, Inside the Tudor Home, as a beautiful way to really step across the threshold and see what it's like to live inside a Tudor home. Beth Ann has graciously provided an incredible list of resources, some that she used for writing her book and others that are just ones you don't want to miss if you're exploring this history. And we will place links to all of these and some extras in the show notes for today's episode. So make sure you stay tuned for the URL for where to see the complete list. Now, Beth Ann, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible. So your choice would be in addition to those.
That is such a difficult question.
It's the hardest one on the list, yes.
Yeah, it really is. Oh my gosh. I don't think I could just choose one. I don't know. I think part of me would want to choose a clever answer and say, something like a survival book or a really, really big book like War and Peace, because you're never going to finish it. You're going to be reading it for days and days and days.
Oh, my students, cover your ears. Of course you can finish War and Peace.
But no, I think my truthful answer, my honest answer, I would have to take one of the Harry Potter books with me. Because I think when you're stuck...
that's a great choice.
Yeah, when you're stuck on the desert island and, you're probably not feeling too great, you just want something to take your mind off it. You want something fun. You want this whimsical place that you can escape to. So I would choose one of the Harry Potter books, I think.
I see the reasoning in that, and I love them as well. So that's a great selection. I think that's a good choice. What's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
So I'm actually finishing up my third book at the moment. There's a little plug for my third book. It's about women in the Victorian era. So that should be coming out soon. I'm also very, very close to submitting my PhD thesis, which is on medieval children. And I'm really hoping that once it's all finished, I can share more about the lives of children all the way through the Middle Ages and into the Tudor times.
That's fascinating. Goes well and that you get your PhD. What an accomplishment. That's a huge thing to be undertaking. And of course, we're thrilled about your upcoming book because we enjoyed going inside the Tudor home with you this week so much. We know that your future work will be just as fabulous. Thank you so much, Beth Ann Watts, for being here this week and taking us inside the homes that Shakespeare would have lived in and what that would have been like for people from his time period. We really appreciate you taking the time to visit and take us on this tour. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Cassidy. Thank you so much for having me.
All of the resources we've talked about in the show today, including more information about Beth Ann Watts and her work into children and the life of the everyday person in Tudor and medieval England, are all available in the show notes for our podcast. I've also compiled a list of related podcast episodes you might enjoy if you enjoy tackling the history of what it was like to live in a domestic domicile for Shakespeare's lifetime. All of these things are listed for you right now on our episode page at CassidyCash.com/episode 433. And if you would like to check out the members' extras and go behind the scenes of today's episode, you can find all of that by clicking the membership buttons available on the episode page. Again, the show notes URL for this week is CassidyCash.com/episode 433. That Shakespeare Life is researched and produced by me, Cassidy Cash. Our audio engineer is Gary Mayholm. That's it for this week. Thank you for listening. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.